kid called Craig Box.
I do.
Good morning, Mr. Boggs.
Good morning, Mr. Burge. How are you?
You state your name for the court, please.
My name is Craig Box.
And Mr. Boggs, where do you live?
I live in Enid, Oklahoma.
And what's your profession?
I'm an attorney,
And married?
41 years to go.
Okay. And you're here today to testify about the effect of opioids, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And before we get into your testimony, you're not here to lay blame on anybody or go to the cause of whatever your son's death was. You're just going to tell what happened as a result of him taking opioids. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, you lost your son Austin to opioids, correct?
I did.
So tell the court a little bit about Austin.
Austin was the youngest of our 3 children. We had 2 daughters, Courtney and Whitney, and Austin. They were all 4 years apart. He was the baby. He was doted on. He was just a wonderful child. By the time he was born, my wife we could afford to stop her teaching, and she was able to stay home with him, where she couldn't with the older 2. And he just, I think her influence helped. He was just a really kind-hearted, sweet boy. At the same time, he was all boy. He was very athletic. He was always big for his age. He always seemed to be the tallest and fastest kid in his class. Intelligent child, flew through school, never any problems. He was one of those kids that from the time he was in grade school through junior high and high school and even at the University of Oklahoma, people gravitated to him, and at the same time, he made them feel better about themselves. It was just, he was a joy. He was a special young man. I've been asked this question before, and sometimes I say, how much time do you have? You love all your children. But Austin was, my wife says always, he was blessed with her best qualities and my best qualities.
Was he an athlete?
He was an athlete.
Tell the court about that.
Well, as I said, from the time he was young, like I said, he was, I always said that he was very sweet, mild, tender-hearted. When he crossed the white line, he was very competitive, but he was extremely athletic. He was one of those boys, for whatever reason, never went through that awkward stage. He excelled in all sports. Like I said, he was tall and kind of big for his age, but notwithstanding, he was usually the fastest kid in his class. Played primarily football, basketball, and baseball. He began being recruited by major colleges when he was a freshman at junior high at the time. As a freshman, he was moved up to varsity at Enid High. Started on the football team as a freshman. Started on the baseball team as a freshman. And was a 6th man on the varsity basketball team as a freshman. I gained in a town like Enid, gained a lot of notoriety. I always seemed to handle it well. Was recruited heavily. Senior year in high school, he was all-state, obviously in football and baseball. He was a high school All-American. But his dream was to play at the University of Oklahoma from the time he was little. So much so that he kind of broke his mom and I's heart. He graduated early from Enid High. He was a good student. And left us his senior year and enrolled early because that's what he wanted to do.
And how did he do at the University of Oklahoma?
Well, notwithstanding the injuries, he did very well. He redshirted his first year primarily because of an injury. Each of the subsequent years, he had an injury, but rehabbed, and the 3 years he was played, he fought his way back on the field to start at one of the linebacker positions, middle linebacker, weak side linebacker, strong side linebacker, in the system they ran then. And he was, I mean, anybody that, I mean, he started at University of Oklahoma, and so he was a special athlete.
And how did his teammates feel about him from what you observed?
Well, like I said, one thing that sticks out in my mind is at his funeral, Coach Stoops spoke, and he jokingly said Austin was a character. And it was just one of those things that everybody liked. Austin, I mean, Austin never said a bad thing about anybody. He was just one of those kids that was very compassionate, and like I said, everybody enjoyed him. And it really didn't hit us, I think, until his funeral. All the team and former players and coaches were there, and they gave us a tribute video they created from him that my wife uses today.
Yeah. And did he suffer a back injury?
Yeah, he, as a sophomore in high school, it's a fairly common injury, as we learned, PARS, kind of a small fracture in his lower back that got weightlifting, and he had that, but he managed that and dealt with that early on, and then he eventually, before his last year at the University of Oklahoma, suffered a herniated disc.
And tell the court about the herniated disc and what he went through.
Well, as I alluded to, I mean, he had several injuries at the University of Oklahoma. Nothing, I mean, he had Tommy John surgery at one point, but he had a couple of minor knee surgeries, and he always came back. But that year, I remember distinctly because we'd gone down for the last scrimmage for the start of the season, and parents can attend the scrimmage. And he was starting middle linebacker for the University of Oklahoma, and he was very excited because he'd finally been healthy for a period of time and gained weight, and had a great scrimmage. And we were down there on a Saturday, and the next day I called him, or he had complained a little bit about his back that evening. I drove down. He said it was hurting quite a bit, and I drove down on a Sunday evening and met him with Brock Schnabel with McBride, who's one of the team doctors. And they did an MRI. And Brock told him, and it was devastating because he had fought through so much, and now here's another thing. And so he was in the McBride clinic for several days. Basically, they put him in traction. They didn't want to do surgery. And I stayed with him, slept in a recliner. And like he went back and rehabbed. And worked hard to get back on the field, and toward the end of the season, he was back on the field and back in the starting lineup. I mean, Austin never complained. We'd ask him, how you doing? I'm fine. And he just pushed himself.
And did he have any history of drug abuse or mental problems or anything like that, Craig?
No.
And did they do surgery on the ruptured disc?
No.
And that was was that in August of 10, I believe?
Yeah, Mike, that would have been first couple of weeks of August 2010.
2010. Okay, bring us forward from there about what Austin did about his education and what he was doing.
Well, he like I said, he graduated early from high school, and he had taken some AP courses, and by the time he was a junior at OU, he had enough to graduate, and he graduated. He graduated from the University of Oklahoma the Saturday before he died on a Thursday.
And how did you learn of Austin's death?
Well, I learned there was a problem. I was actually in court in beautiful Tologa, Oklahoma. And I'd gotten a call from the office. They said, your wife is trying to get a hold of you. There is a problem with Austin. And told Judge Bozarth, I said, Judge, I gotta leave. And called I just took off he'd been in El Reno. And I took off and called my wife and learned that he'd apparently been discovered unconscious in a home of a friend in El Reno and was at the hospital there.
And he passed away.
Yeah. They metaflied him from El Reno to Oklahoma City. And they tried to revive him in the hospital in Oklahoma City. And were unable to do so.
And
Mr. Fox, could you put that microphone a little closer?
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
And what caused Austin's death?
Well, what we learned afterward was he had opioids in his system.
And there were several.
Yes.
Correct? And did you ever try to make a determination about who manufactured those opioids?
No. I didn't.
Did you ever try to make a determination whether they were generic or branded?
No, it didn't matter. I mean,
Did you ever try to
nothing.
make any determination about who supplied the feed vein for the opioids or anything like that?
No.
Who distributed them?
No, sir.
Okay. So the ruptured disc was in August of 2010,
Yes, sir.
and Austin's death was May 18th, 2011.
May 19th.
May 19th, 2011.
Yes.
As a result of what you and Gail have been through, was the foundation formed?
Yeah. I can't explain what happens to you as a parent when a child dies. But I guess because of, Austin had some notoriety, and in the aftermath of his death, there was quite a bit of publicity. We heard from so many parents across that have lost children in similar circumstances, that same story as us, had no idea, had no clue about the prevalence of these drugs and the dangers of these drugs and And we decided that, Austin's death was not going to be in vain. So we created a foundation, the Austin Box 12 Foundation. 12 was his number at the University of Oklahoma. And, it's evolved over the years, but the purpose is to try to warn other parents. My wife, God bless her, she does this. She speaks all the time to any group, no matter how small or large. We have a scholarship, and we donate to law enforcement agencies for naloxone and to various parents, helping parents and things of that nature. But the primary purpose is to educate and warn parents about how highly addictive these drugs are, how it doesn't have to be prescription. I mean, they're everywhere. And because parents, students, she speaks to athletic teams, she speaks to Indian tribes. People just don't understand what they can do and how quickly they can do it.
And when you say that through your work in the foundation that these drugs or opioids are everywhere, what do you mean by that?
Well, I think that the thing is, and it was touched upon yesterday, we never suspected anything. In 2011, this crisis that everybody on both sides of the aisle calls it, nobody knew about. And what we've learned is that Austin must have been getting them from the street or wherever, that you don't have to look far to find them. You don't have to have a prescription. You don't have to look at them. They're just everywhere, and people don't understand that.
And did you later find out that Austin at one time did have a prescription?
Yeah, and my wife did, candidly. After she found a bottle at home, I want to say it was a 30-day script, and I don't remember exactly what opioid it was. I think it was OxyContin. That had several pills still left in the bottle. And that was after his herniated disc.
In August of 2010.
Well, that's when that occurred.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Fox.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Box, thank you for coming today. Austin never used a patch or Dependadol, did he?
I don't know if he did or didn't, candidly.
Never found a prescription for either?
I didn't.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
We have nothing further, Your Honor. Thank you, Mr. Fox. Thank you, Craig.
The state calls Dr. David Cortright. Judge, may I approach and hand you the exhibits we'll be using with Dr. Cortright?
Yes, you may.
Thank you.
Dr. Cortright. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Put that microphone right up close to your mouth.
Good morning, Dr. Cortright.
Good morning.
Can you please introduce yourself to the court?
I'm David Cortright. I'm a history professor emeritus at the University of North Florida in Jacksonville, Florida.
And how long were you a history professor, Dr. Cortright?
Gosh, 40-year career.
And what subjects of history did you teach?
Mainly medical history and U.S. history.
And you also researched in these areas as well, correct?
Correct.
Now, Dr. Cortright, you provided a CV to us in this case, and we turned that over to the defendants in this case, right?
Yes.
Okay, I would like to approach and hand you that, and we'll walk through your qualifications. Now, Dr. Cortright, is this that curriculum vitae that you provided to us?
Yes.
Okay, and let's walk through some of this. Prior to becoming a professor at the University of North Florida, from which you retired, what did you do for a living and where did you work?
Well, I began my career as a graduate student at Rice University, where I earned my PhD. I was a faculty associate in epidemiology at the University of Texas School of Public Health back in 78, 79. My first history teaching job was at the University of Hartford from 1979 until 1988. I was also an assistant clinical professor in the Department of Community Medicine at the University of Connecticut Health Center from 81 to 88, and then I moved to Florida, and I finished my career at the University of North Florida.
Now, you mentioned that you got a PhD at Rice University. What did you specialize in research for that PhD?
I wrote my dissertation on the history of opiate addiction in the United States.
And did that dissertation that you wrote eventually become a book that was published?
Yes, it was published by Harvard University Press in 1982.
And what was the name of that book?
It's called Dark Paradise, A History of Opiate Addiction in America.
A History of Opiate Addiction in America. Now, you wrote this book. It's been published by the Harvard Press. It was also reprinted more recently, is that right?
Yes, there was a second edition in 2001.
Okay. May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes, amen.
Now, Dr. Cortright, I've just handed you State's Exhibit 2819. Is this a copy of Dark Paradise, the book that was published based on your dissertation?
Well, this is the revised edition, yes, the one that was published in 2001.
And you wrote this book?
Yes.
All right, Dr. Cortright, how long did you do the research in order to write this book, Dark Paradise?
Well, I spent the years 1975 to 79 working on the dissertation, and then I revised and expanded the dissertation, and as I say, the book first appeared in 1982.
And is Dark Paradise a reliable source that other professionals in history and in the medical fields rely on and cite?
Yes.
Dr. Cortright, are there some relevant passages from Dark Paradise that you may want to read into the record today?
Yes.
You've also published some other works, including articles, etc., in journals. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And have they been peer-reviewed?
Yes.
Are they likewise works that are typically or commonly relied upon by professionals in history and the medical fields?
Yes.
All right, Dr. Cortright, you said that you specialized in the history of opiate addiction in America, right?
Yes, that's certainly one of my research areas, and the one for which I'm best known.
Have you published any other books related to addiction?
Oh, yes. I published an oral history-based book called Addicts Who Survived, 1989. I published a book called Forces of Habit, which is about drugs and alcohol in world history, and I've also published another book called The Age of Addiction, which is also dealing with world history.
In addition to your work as an historian publishing works. Have you also received some awards and honors?
I have, yes.
And I've now placed up some of your CV on the screen here. Can you please walk us through the awards, accolades you've received?
Well, I was elected president of the Alcohol and Drugs History Society, which is an international scholarly organization devoted to the subject. I received a College on Problems of Drug Dependence Award for the book Forces of Habit, which I mentioned a moment ago. Received several NEH fellowships, including one that supported the work on addicts who survived. And I received one of the inaugural NEH Public Scholar Awards for the work on the age of addiction. Oh, and I've also received an American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship.
Thank you, Dr. Cortright. And are you indeed an expert on the subject of the history of opioid addiction in America?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time we move for admission of State's Exhibit 4731, which is Dr. Cortright's CV.
Any objection?
Your Honor, my only objection is this is the second time an exhibit has shown up that is not on the exhibit list. I will permit you to introduce it, but let's not have that again if we can.
Thank you, Mr. Ottaway. You'll admit 4731 into the evidence.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Cortright, is this the cover of Dark Paradise as it appears in paperback form?
Yes.
You can get this on Amazon, right?
Yes.
And this details a long history of opiate or opioid addiction in America, right?
Correct.
Your Honor, with these qualifications and his history of publishing in this area, we now offer Dr. Cortright as an expert witness on the history of opioid addiction in America.
Subject to the record made earlier, Your Honor.
Thank you. We'll note that and we'll admit Dr. Cortright as an expert.
Thank you, Judge. Now, Dr. Cortright, why is it important that we understand the history of opioid addiction in America?
I think it's important that we understand it because we've been burned before. We've been through this before. And we learned important lessons about how to prevent epidemics of medical opiate addiction. I think it's also important that the knowledge that we learned became part of medical culture and that what we're going through now might very well have been foreseen.
You said what we're going through now. Dr. Cortright, you are aware that this country and indeed the state of Oklahoma are currently experiencing an opioid crisis.
Yes.
And are you aware that that opioid crisis primarily involves prescription opioids?
Yes.
And Dr. Cortright, is this the first epidemic of medical opioid addiction in the United States?
No, definitely not.
It's happened before.
Yes.
Can you please briefly describe the first medical opioid epidemic in this country?
Well, there's always some opiate addiction in the United States, but it wasn't really a significant problem until the late 19th century, and in particular the 1870s and 1880s saw a big increase in medical opiate addiction. We know that because the per capita consumption of medicinal opiates tripled between 1870 and 1890.
1870 and 1890, is that about the time frame that this first opioid addiction epidemic occurred?
That's when it becomes really bad, yes.
And again, this was a medical opioid addiction epidemic in part, correct?
It was primarily driven by medical addiction, yes.
And did it involve liberal prescribing and use of opioids to treat pain by physicians?
That was one of the primary causes. In fact, it was the primary cause of the epidemic.
And Dr. Cortright, I've heard you use a phrase to describe when addiction occurs through a physician. You know what phrase I'm talking about?
Iatrogenic.
Iatrogenic addiction. Can you please tell the court what iatrogenic addiction is?
Well, like many words in medicine, it's a Greek word. It comes from iatros, which means doctor, and genic, which means caused by. So it's an addiction that's caused by a doctor.
And this first medical opioid epidemic was an epidemic of iatrogenic addiction.
Largely, yes.
All right,
Go ahead
Doctor.
and spell that for the record. Not a test, Mr. Dent.
No, I get it. Iatrogenic. IATROGENIC. And Dr. Cortright, who did this first medical opioid addiction epidemic affect?
Mainly, well, it affected people in all different classes, but the most typical victim of this epidemic was middle-aged, middle class, or higher woman, native-born, white. That was actually one of the interesting discoveries in the book. Many people have long thought this was about the Civil War, that most of the addicts were Civil War veterans who had been crippled. But in fact, a substantial majority were female, kinds of people who went to doctors.
And you said that per capita consumption of opioids tripled in this time period. Yes?
Correct, medicinal opiates.
All right, thank you. Now, did we learn some important lessons from this first opioid addiction epidemic?
Yes, and one of the most important lessons we learned is it was a bad idea to liberally prescribe these drugs to treat chronic non-cancer pain.
Why?
Because of the risk of addiction, and in the early accounts, there are also many mentions of overdose deaths, infections, opiate-dependent infants in the case of pregnant women.
Now-
The moral character of many of these addicts deteriorated. That was noted by physicians.
Now, in direct response to this first addiction epidemic in the late 1800s, did physicians become more conservative in the way they used and prescribed opioids?
Yes, over time they did. It didn't happen overnight, but it was a gradual process, and there was definitely a change in outlook.
And you've coined a phrase to describe this conservative approach to using opioids, correct?
Yes,
What is that phrase?
narcotic conservatism.
And so when we use the phrase narcotic conservatism today, you understand we'll be referring to that ethos or that idea that physicians should not prescribe opioids liberally, but should be conservative in the way they use them. Fair?
That's the heart of it, although I think there were other aspects of it as well.
By narcotic, the word narcotic, do you mean opioids?
Yes,
And by exercising what you have termed narcotic conservatism, was this country able to put an end to the very first medical opioid addiction epidemic in this country?
yes,
You document all of this in Dark Paradise, right?
yes.
And did you create a diagram to help illustrate narcotic conservatism?
I did.
All right, may I approach, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
And Dr. Cortright, is this that diagram?
It is.
And was this diagram created by you or at your direction?
Yes,
And you intend to use this diagram to assist you in explaining what narcotic conservatism is and how it works.
Excuse me, Your Honor.
yes.
That's a leading question. I've been letting it go, but I would object on the basis of leading.
I can rephrase it.
Noted.
Will this indeed help you assist your testimony in explaining what narcotic conservatism is and how it works?
I believe so, yes.
Your Honor, we ask permission to publish this demonstrative.
Any objection by the defendants?
Is it demonstrative? I don't have a question. No.
Permission to publish.
Thank you. All right, Dr. Cortright, this is the demonstrative you created to help explain narcotic conservatism. Can you please explain to the court what this is showing?
Well, it's showing that this ethic of narcotic conservatism that developed in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries served as a barrier, if you will, a dam that prevented another wave of medical opiate addiction from sweeping over the country.
And was narcotic conservatism a barrier to overprescribing?
Yes,
Was it also a barrier to overconsumption?
yes,
And are you familiar with the phrase primary prevention?
Yes.
What is that?
Well, it means never letting a disease or a condition develop in the first place, essentially.
Was the heart of narcotic conservatism, this new approach by physicians to be conservative with opioids, was the heart of that primary prevention?
Yes, that was both a goal and a result of this new approach.
Was the goal to prevent new opioid addicts?
Yes.
And did this goal of not wanting to create new opioid addicts result in less prescribing of opioids?
Well, it did. Narcotic conservatism generally resulted in fewer prescriptions for opiates.
If a person is never exposed to opioids, can they get addicted to opioids?
No.
And did narcotic conservatism grow stronger throughout the late 1800s and early 20th century?
It did.
How long did narcotic conservatism remain in place in this country?
For most of the 20th century.
Are you saying that we were careful with opioids for 100 years in this country?
I'd go beyond that.
Leading-
Sustained.
Thank you.
So for how long were we careful with opioids?
Well, the ethic begins to develop in the last 3 decades of the 19th century and continues to strengthen during the 20th century and is not really challenged until the late 1980s and early 1990s.
And during that time frame you just described, did this approach, this conservative approach to opioids, prevent another medical opioid addiction epidemic in this country?
Yes.
And that's based on your research and expertise as a historian in opioid addiction in America.
Yes.
Based on that same expertise and your research, Dr. Cortright, if narcotic conservatism had not been undermined in the 80s and 90s, as you said, would we be in the current prescription opioid epidemic that we're in?
No.
Excuse me, doctor. I object to the form of the question. Dr. Cortright's disclosure indicates he's here to talk about things before 1980. That's what he was qualified on. Now we've stretched into the 90s, and I object to that. It's outside the scope of his disclosure.
Your Honor, we addressed these same things in the deposition. They've been on notice of them. He's not here to speak about the specifics of the current crisis or epidemic, but more generally about the history and how that history affects us today.
Objection is overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor. I'll just note for the record that in the deposition and in the disclosure, Professor Cortright said he was not here to testify about anything that occurred after 1980.
All right, Dr. Cortright, let's look at this first opioid addiction epidemic in the United States. And may I approach again, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
Dr. Cortright, I just handed you 2 pictures which you provided to me, and which we have labeled in this case as States Exhibit 2862. That's the first picture. And the second picture is States Exhibit 2863. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, these are pictures of 2 women that are shown as, or that will help you to explain the story of this first epidemic, correct?
Yes.
And in particular, one of those pictures is an actual addict from this time period.
Correct.
And the other is a portrayal of that very same addict in a movie in the 1960s.
That's correct.
And will these pictures indeed assist you in your testimony today?
Yes.
Permission to publish these pictures, Your Honor?
I guess for the record, I should object to both pictures of a former addict and Katharine Hepburn. I don't see as relevant to this discussion.
We're not offering them for any truth of any matter asserted. It's merely illustrative, Judge. We just want to use them as demonstratives, more or less.
I'll overrule the defendant's objection and allow them to be published.
Thank you, Judge. Dr. Cortright, who is this we're looking at?
That's Ella O'Neill, that's the mother of the famous American playwright Eugene O'Neill. She was a morphine addict.
And how, well, first of all, let me ask this. Was she an example of a prototypical addict from the late 1800s?
Not only prototypical, I'd say she was probably the most famous morphine addict of the late 19th century.
How did she become famous?
Because her son immortalized, if that's the word, her condition in one of the greatest of all American dramas, Long Day's Journey into Night.
And did that play receive any awards?
It did. O'Neill wrote it around 1940-41. It was performed posthumously. It won a Tony Award. It won a Pulitzer Prize.
Now, you said she was addicted to morphine. Is
Yes.
morphine an opioid?
Oh, yes. It's the principal active alkaloid of opium.
And who got Ella O'Neill addicted to morphine?
A physician who administered the drug to her after the birth of Eugene, her third son. It was a very difficult and painful labor.
And did she remain addicted for a long period of time?
For 25 years, yes.
And you mentioned the play Long Day's Journey into Night. What is this second picture?
This is of the actress Katharine Hepburn, who is playing the character Mary Tyrone in this intensely autobiographical play. She was closely modeled on Eugene O'Neill's mother, Ella.
And is she also playing the prototypical opioid addict of the late 1800s?
Yes,
This was in 1962.
that's when the movie was released, yes.
Was knowledge of the first opioid epidemic in this country a part of the collective American memory into the 60s?
Yes,
Now, Dr. Cortright, have you also read To Kill a Mockingbird?
I have, as I assume most people in this courtroom have.
Is there also a prototypical opioid addict, or at least a remnant of one, in that book?
Yes, there's a character, Mrs. Henry Lafayette Dubose, who is an aged and cantankerous character in the novel who was evidently addicted to morphine some time before.
And was To Kill a Mockingbird published in the 60s?
Yes.
Now, Dr. Cortright, you've mentioned morphine. How did Ella O'Neill and many of these early opioid addicts, how was the opioid administered to many of them?
She injected it. We know that, in fact, because her son Eugene once walked into her room while she was injecting it.
So is it your testimony that this first medical opioid addiction epidemic involved the hypodermic syringe?
Primarily, that was a primary source of it, yes.
Can you please explain the significance of the hypodermic syringe and morphine injections during this time?
Well, the hypodermic syringe was a technology that was developed in the 1850s for the purpose of injecting morphine. And like many new medical technologies, it took a while to catch on. It first came to the United States in 1856. A few physicians started using it, but it really didn't gain general acceptance until the 1870s. And by the end of the 1870s, virtually every American physician had one. And I think it's not coincidental that that's also the decade when you first see the big increase in medical morphine addiction.
Before the hypodermic syringe, how were opioids typically administered?
Orally.
And were there some problems with taking opioids orally?
Yes, they were slower acting. There was always a possibility of stomach upset.
Did physicians understand at this time that taking opioids orally could lead to addiction?
Oh, yes.
You've seen that in the medical literature.
Yes.
Now, did doctors initially understand the dangers of injecting morphine using a hypodermic syringe?
No, not always. No.
Permission to approach?
Yes.
Dr. Cortright, I've just handed you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 2858. Can you please briefly tell us what, well, let me ask this. Is this an article or a letter that was published in the Atlanta Medical and Surgical Journal?
It's an article, yes.
All right, and was this article published in the 1800s in this time period that you've been discussing?
It was published in 1867, yes.
And you've seen this before?
Oh, yes, I used this in my research, among other sources.
And this is an accurate copy of the very same article you referred to that you used in your research. You've seen this before?
Yes.
Your Honor, we move for admission of State's Exhibit 2858, which is an article from the Atlanta Medical and Surgical Journal.
If this is intended as a learned treatise, Your Honor, this article was of 1881?
1867.
1867. I have an objection to it being admitted. Learned treatises are not admitted, although if the doctor finds it helpful to him, he can certainly comment on it.
Your Honor, it's not being offered for the truth of the matter asserted. It's not hearsay. We just want to show what the existing medical thinking was at the time.
I'll sustain the defendant's objection, but certainly Dr. Cortright can reference any part of the exhibit.
Yes, Your Honor, and to assist with his testimony, may I publish the relevant part?
Publish.
Thank you, Judge. All right, Dr. Cortright, this is on the second page of the exhibit I handed you. What is this that we're looking at on the screen here?
Well, this is the article you referred to earlier. It's published by Dr. William Green, and it appeared in the Atlanta Medical and Surgical Journal. This is an article written by someone who's recently taken to using hypodermic injections with what he calls the most satisfactory results.
And can you please read the relevant part that you want to point out to the court?
Yes, toward the bottom of that first paragraph, he says, "I now enter the chamber of suffering, knowing that I have in my possession an unfailing remedy for pain. Relieve me of my pain, doctor, is the cry of the sufferer. With a hypodermic syringe, this agonizing cry can be promptly and without injury hushed."
Without injury. What is the significance of that phrase, Dr. Cortright?
No bad effects from the use of the drug in this way.
Now, I've heard you make reference in the past to a holy grail of pain relief. Is that what this doctor is referring to here?
Yes, I think that's fair. It's as if he's found this holy grail and this technique that can instantly and safely eliminate pain.
And this is one example. Are there other examples in the medical literature of physicians early on stating that the hypodermic injection of morphine is safe?
Yes, there are.
Was injecting morphine as safe as physicians initially thought that it was?
It was not.
Permission to approach?
Yes.
And what is this that I've just handed you, Dr. Cortright?
This is a letter written by a physician named Sewell, which appeared in the medical record, which is a well-known medical journal, in 1870.
And it's marked State's Exhibit 2830 for the record. Dr. Cortright, is this the kind of medical literature that you typically commonly rely on in doing your research?
Yes, it is.
And in fact, you yourself found this article in doing your research.
Correct.
You've relied on it in your research, and you're relying on it today to testify.
Yes.
Your Honor, we'd ask that this letter that was published in the medical record be admitted into evidence.
Your Honor, I object. This one doesn't even qualify as a learned medical treatise to escape the hearsay
To escape the
hearsay exception.
Your Honor, again, this is used to show what the then existing impressions of the medical community were. We think that it's an exception to the hearsay rule and should be admitted for the truth of what's being stated here.
It is clearly offered for the truth of the matter asserted. It is clearly hearsay, and it clearly does not fall into any exception.
Sustain the defendant's objection.
I'm sorry, Judge, I didn't quite hear that.
Sustain the defendant's objection.
All right, Dr. Cortright, well, Judge, may I publish this one like the last one?
Permission to publish.
Thank you, Judge.
I would object to that as well, since it's not a learned treatise.
I overrule that objection.
All right, Dr. Cortright, what is this exhibit that we're looking at here?
Well, that's a letter, and if I may comment, letters in medical journals are refereed by the editors. It's essentially just a very short article is what it comes down to. There are other letters that have appeared in medical journals in this matter that are in fact quite significant. But this is an objection to this idea, which was current at the time, that hypodermic medication with morphine was safe. Dr. Sewell has recently read an article by a Dr. Bill who makes the following statement. When long continued use of morphia is required, the danger of the habit of opium eating will be avoided if we inject the opiate. And Dr. Sewell goes on to say that's absolutely wrong and proceeds to document 2 cases of people who were clearly performing the habit, or in one case had become a full-blown addict and suffered severe consequences as a result.
So, unlike the prior document we looked at, is this letter cautioning against the liberal use of injecting morphine?
Yes.
And what is the reason for this caution?
Because of the likelihood that it will lead to addiction, and in fact he has documented cases.
And as you say, this Dr. Sewell goes on to explain those documented cases.
He does, yes.
Now, did examples like the 2 addicts that he goes on to explain, did those examples multiply across the country?
Yeah, and that's the point of these illustrations. Cases like this started piling up in the medical literature in the late 19th century. There's this warning literature. Look, don't do this. I've encountered patients who have become terribly addicted to hypodermic injections of morphine. And those become more and more common.
So over the course of the next few years that you're discussing here, we see more and more in the medical literature, the research that you look at, in the medical literature about narcotic conservatism?
Correct.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
Dr. Cortright, I've just handed you a big book. What is that book?
Oh, this is a book by Dr. Harry Hubble Kane.
When was it published?
This was published in 1881.
And why is this book important?
Because in addition to the medical journal literature, people were beginning to write books about the dangers of medical narcotic addiction in the late 19th century. And this is a classic. In fact, it's still available in reprint editions.
And are there portions of this book that are relevant that you'd like to point out to us and read into the record?
There are.
What's the title of this book?
Drugs That Enslave.
And does Drugs That Enslave advocate for the conservative use of opioids?
Yes, it calls attention to the fact that not only in the United States, but in the international medical literature, there's growing alarm about the effects of the hypodermic use of morphine.
And if you'll turn to page 31, please, Doctor.
It is there.
And is there a graphic on this page that will assist you in explaining an important part of this time period?
Yes, there is.
And what is that graphic?
It shows hypodermic apparatus that was typically used at this time.
And Your Honor, this is indeed a learned treatise. We just like to explain some of the relevant portions and read them in the record. We're not asking that the entire book be admitted into evidence. May I publish the page that he just referred to?
Your Honor, so long as the witness relies on it and testifies it's a learned treatise, I have no objection to it being shown.
With that precondition, I will allow permission, page 31 to be published.
Yeah. Dr. Cortright, is this a learned treatise?
Yes,
And have you relied upon this exact learned treatise in your research and your testimony today?
yes,
And will this graphic assist you in your testimony today?
yes.
Your Honor?
Permission granted.
Thank you. All right, Dr. Cortright, please explain to the court what it is we're looking at.
So these are the hypodermic syringes I referred to a moment ago. These were typical of what would have been in use in the early 1880s.
Thank you. And then on the previous page, page 30, there's a particular passage I'd like to call your attention to. It starts with, "There is no proceeding in medicine." Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
All right. And Dr. Cortright, can you please read that section into the record?
There is no proceeding in medicine that has become so rapidly popular, no method of allaying pain so prompt in its action and permanent in its effect, no plan of medication that has been so carelessly used and so thoroughly abused, and no therapeutic discovery that has been so great a blessing and so great a curse to mankind as the hypodermic injection of morphia.
By morphia, does Dr. Kane mean morphine?
Yes, there were many spellings of the word in the 19th century. This is one of them.
Can you please turn to page 73?
Yes.
All right. What is this page 73 showing?
This is a male nurse at Bellevue Hospital in New York City who's near the end of his life. He's covered with abscesses. He is a morphine addict.
Was this a real person?
Yes.
And was this based on a photograph of that real person?
Yes, that's what the book says.
Now, what's the title of this book again?
Drugs that enslave.
And did in fact morphine enslave the people who were addicted to it?
Yes, and that was a common metaphor for addiction, not only in the 19th century, but even before the 19th century.
Now, in this graphic, this picture, is this showing a man who was so addicted that he continued injecting himself despite the obvious harm?
Yes.
Can you please turn to page 18 of this book, Drugs That Enslave? There's a paragraph at the very end of page 18.
I see it.
Can you please read that passage into the record?
Those not acquainted with the truth in this matter will be surprised to learn that there are today thousands of educated and respectable people in all countries and among all classes, confirmed habitués, slaves to a habit that is more exacting than the hardest taskmaster, that they loathe beyond all else, and yet that binds them in chains that they are wholly unable to break. Everything must give way to this vice. Business is neglected or but imperfectly performed. Family ties are sundered. Hope, ambition, happiness, self-respect are meaningless words. The one thing that fills the mind is the gratification of this passion, which they loathe, but from which they cannot break. Thus, from day to day, week to week, year to year, they go on, not living, simply existing. Each day, each hour, each minute binds them more firmly, until at last they feel their own inability to cope with the demon that has overpowered them, and abandon themselves hopelessly, listlessly to the vice. Repentance comes too late. The momentary pleasure, the short period of excitement, The hour of vivacity bears fruit 1,000-fold. Fruit, the bitter taste of which must last them a lifetime. That which at first gave them pleasure has now become the veriest tyrant, enforcing long hours of pain and anguish, gloom and despondency. They do not continue its use because it gives them pleasure, but simply because it is the only thing that, in increasing doses, can save them from the torment it has itself imposed, because without it they are sunk into a living hell.
When was that passage written, Dr. Cortright?
1881.
Sounds like it could have been written yesterday, doesn't it?
Excuse me, Your Honor, I object to that. He's only here to testify prior to...
I'll withdraw the question. Thank you, Judge. Now, we've seen a few examples here of early cautions in the medical literature about using, liberally, morphine to treat pain.
Yes.
Why are these early examples so important?
Oh, because they continue to accumulate, and they eventually help persuade doctors to be more conservative with respect to these drugs.
So when did the debate about whether to use opioids to treat chronic non-malignant pain first begin?
Around 1870, and then it accelerated into the 1880s, so it began more than a century before the present. I mean, what's happening here is you have this potent new opiate-based technology, and there are problems. And so you have this controversy that erupts in the medical literature. And as you say, that controversy began a long time ago.
How was that debate resolved?
It was resolved in favor of the conservative position.
And did medical professionals begin looking for substitutes for opioids?
They did.
Permission to approach? Dr. Cortright, what is this?
This is an article by Dr. James Adams, Substitutes for Opium in Chronic Diseases.
And it's marked as States Exhibit 2831. Dr. Cortright, what journal did this appear in?
This appeared in the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal in 1889. That journal is the forerunner of the New England Journal of Medicine.
You could lean closer to the mic.
Oh, I apologize. It appeared in the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal in 1889, and that journal was the forerunner to the New England Journal of Medicine.
This is the kind of medical literature that you commonly refer to and rely on in your research and for your testimony today?
Yes.
And is this indeed a learned treatise upon which you've relied?
Yes.
And are there some passages you would like to refer the court to in here?
Yes.
Your Honor, same thing with this one. We'd just like to point out a few relevant provisions to be read into the record.
Called off this exhibit to be published but not admitted into the evidence.
Thank you, Your Honor. It's a learned treatise.
All right. Dr. Cortright, can you please tell us what Dr. Adams is advocating for in this article?
Well, he starts out by stating that opium is in all of its forms, a very valuable drug, indeed indispensable, but he's advocating for substituting wherever possible other drugs for its use. And he calls attention to the fact that there are a number of problems with opiates. He points out that opiates are highly toxic and cause death. They can produce side effects. This was well known in the 19th century, everything from constipation to depression. And then, of course, he points out that they're highly addictive. And indeed, he estimated that there were 150,000 medical opiate addicts in the United States by the time he published this article in 1889.
1889. So is this article an example of the establishment of narcotic conservatism in the medical community?
It's, yes, I mean, it's another brick in the dam, so to speak. This is, again, an ongoing process, but this is a very good example of the emergence of that attitude.
And does Dr. Adams advocate for using different drugs besides opioids in this process?
He does, yes.
All right, can you please read the first paragraph of this article?
So that one Well, there's an advertisement for aspirin that appeared in the Carter, Oklahoma Express.
So aspirin became available when?
1923. Well, the aspirin became available commercially in 1899. This is, I believe, a 1923 newspaper ad.
1899, aspirin comes out. Is that the exact same aspirin that we still use today?
Yes.
Okay, what is this State's Exhibit 2865? Is that the ad you were referring to?
Yes.
And it was published in the Carter Express, right?
Correct.
Right here in Oklahoma.
Yes.
And on the last page of this exhibit, we see that that ad for aspirin is indeed blown up.
Yes.
Is this the kind of sources that you commonly rely upon in doing your research?
Yes.
And you're relying on it today for your testimony?
Yes.
Your Honor, we'd ask to publish this on the screen.
Your Honor, I don't know what relevance the Carter newspaper has. The man has testified aspirin was invented 30 years before this ad.
Your Honor, the purpose of this is to show that there were advertisements for aspirin right here in Oklahoma in the time period he's talking about. So this is going to help him illustrate the story, history that he's telling. We'd ask that this be allowed to be published so that Dr. Cortright can explain those parts of the ad that are so significant.
State's Exhibit 2865 will be permitted to be published.
All right, Dr. Cortright, is this the ad that you have in front of you there?
Yes.
What's significant about this ad?
Well, it says that doctors have been prescribing aspirin safely for a long time, which is true. And by the way, aspirin in this country was a prescription drug up until about 1915, and then you could buy it over the counter. But to me, the most interesting part of this is actually the list of indications of things that you would use aspirin for. So it says colds, pain, headache, toothache, neuralgia, neuritis, lumbago, rheumatism. And what strikes me is that with possible exception of colds, every one of those conditions would have been treated with opiates in the 19th century. Now this ad is saying, treat them with aspirin instead.
And this ad is by Bayer, right?
Correct. Aspirin was a Bayer product, yes.
Now, the year before aspirin came out in 1899, did Bayer introduce another product for pain?
It did.
What was that product?
Heroin.
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 Was heroin first a prescription opioid drug?
Yes.
And it came out in 1898.
In 1898, yes, that's correct.
Permission to approach?
Yes.
All right, this is State's Exhibit 2875, and is this an ad by Bayer for heroin?
It is.
This is, again, the kind of information or the resources you rely upon in doing your research and giving your testimony today.
Yes, it is.
And in fact, you did rely on this in doing your research and preparing for your testimony today, correct?
Yes.
All right, Your Honor, we move that this be admitted. This is an ad for heroin that Dr. Cortright has relied upon. We don't think that this is necessarily being offered for any truth of a matter being asserted. This is to show that heroin did indeed come out as medicine. We would like to do that, and it will help him give his testimony. And if for no other reason, Judge, we think this should fall under the residual exception to any hearsay objection that's more probative.
I do object on the basis of hearsay, not a learned treatise, no exception offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted.
Lower the objection by the defendant and allow for 2875 to be published.
Dr. Cortright, can you please tell us the significance of this ad?
Well, it's an advertisement for heroin that appeared in a pharmaceutical journal Several things strike me about this. First, it is advertised as a specific for the relief of coughs. So the primary marketing strategy, if you will, was to market heroin as a cough reliever. And it's also available, for example, in cough drops and cough lozenges. But however, the biggest thing is, despite the potency, we all know how potent heroin is. Despite the potency of this drug, there was no epidemic of iatrogenic heroin addiction in the way there had been an epidemic of iatrogenic morphine addiction 30 years ago. This was a puzzle to me. This is a question, like, well, why didn't this happen again? And one of the conclusions that I reached was that, in part, it was because this was marketed relatively narrowly and responsibly, but also because physicians had become much more wary of prescription opioids by 1899 and by the early 1900s.
What does the introduction of heroin tell us about narcotic conservatism?
Well, it tells us that it had taken hold. I'd like to go back to the point I made earlier, which is this is an evolutionary process. This is something that builds up over time. And it's more than just an assertion. I collected several hundred cases of medical addiction from different sources in the early 20th century, and I asked a fairly simple question, which was, what drug did these people start with? And in only 1.7% of the cases was that drug heroin.
So there was
Virtually
not...
all of the others were morphine addicts. So there was not a wave of medical heroin addiction like medical morphine addiction 3 decades before. Now, 10 years later, heroin did become an underworld drug, yes, but initially, no, there was not a lot of medical addiction to heroin.
So your testimony, Dr. Cortright, that narcotic conservatism as it existed at the turn of the century nipped in the bud a potential medical heroin addiction epidemic.
Objection,
Yes.
Your Honor, that's a leading question.
Objection sustained.
Did narcotic conservatism work with respect to heroin?
Yes.
All right, now we've been discussing medical opioids administered by doctors so far. Did narcotic conservatism also affect the use of what are called patent medications?
Yes.
What are patent medications?
Well, they were nostrums. They were secret proprietary formulas. They actually didn't have a patent at all, but they were just these nostrums, which often contain opiates or other potentially habit-forming drugs. And they were marketed for a variety of cures.
All right, and
Let me ask, what is a nostrum?
Like a snake oil medicine, like a product that makes a very broad claim. It will cure neuritis, or it will pep you up, or it will take care of your stomach problems. They were usually bottles. They usually came in packages. They were heavily advertised. They made extravagant claims. But the point I want to make here is they did not, at least initially, list the ingredients. Those were secret. And the reason they were secret, by the way, was to prevent any kind of competition. You know, we've got the magic formula that will cure what ails you, and you have to buy our product because we're not letting on what the secret formula is. Problem is, the secret formula often contain narcotics.
you beat me to my next question. These patent medicines did in fact contain opioids.
Not all of them, but many of them did, yes.
All right, what's an example of a patent medication?
That contained opiates?
Yes.
Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup.
Your Honor, we've got a picture of that we'd like to publish just for illustrative, demonstrative purposes. Permission?
No objection. Permission granted.
I haven't seen it.
Oh, sorry.
think you've seen this one before, Judge. I would object to it for that reason.
This was the subject of a previous objection, which I had sustained. I'm going to go ahead and allow for 2866 to be published at this time.
Thank you, Judge.
Hold the defense objection.
Now, Dr. Cortright, can you please explain to the court what this ad is showing here?
Well, this was a patent medicine, or nostrum, that was widely advertised for squawking babies, in this case, teething babies. A very popular product. And it contained morphine.
Did this ad or the bottles of Miss Winslow's disclose the fact that it contained morphine?
No, not initially.
Were makers of patent medicines required to disclose the fact that their drugs contain narcotics?
No, not prior to the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906.
And what did the Pure Food and Drug Act require?
Well, it required the listing of opiates and certain other potentially habit-forming drugs on the label.
And was the Pure Food and Drug Act a consumer protection act?
Yes, very much so.
Protection from what?
Well, among other things, from protection from the danger of becoming addicted to these drugs.
Now, after that, is it true that makers of patent medications were required to disclose the ingredients on the bottles themselves?
Yes,
And they did in fact do that?
they were required by law, yes.
Permission to approach? Same thing with this one, Judge. This is another patent medication. Very. Dr. Cortright, is this picture showing a patent medication that does in fact disclose morphine?
Yes,
And this is something that you relied on in your research?
yes,
It's something that assists you with your testimony today?
yes.
All right. Your Honor, we'd like to publish this one as well.
No objection as a demonstrative, would object to it as an exhibit.
Permission granted to publish.
All right, Dr. Cortright, can you please explain this one?
Well, this is a container for red cherry cough syrup, and it's typical of what you would have seen after the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act. It lists the ingredients, and one of the ingredients is 1/8 of a grain of morphine sulfate in each fluid ounce, which means that you knew that if you bought this product, you were consuming something that had morphine in it.
Now, can you please turn and tell the court, how did the public respond to learning that opioids were in these patent medications?
They responded warily, and sales of these medications declined.
Was news of the opioid epidemic of the late 1800s a big story?
Yes, and I think that's an important point. We're caught up in the situation today, but we sometimes forget that this was a big news story in the late 19th and the early 20th century. And people were reading the newspapers about the dangers of these drugs, and they would discover that these drugs were in these products that in some cases they've been using for years. They've been recommended to them and their families. They stopped buying them. I saw an interview with one prominent wholesale druggist in Boston who said he used to
Excuse me,
handle the stuff.
Again, that would be hearsay. No substance, no foundation.
Your Honor, can you back up and just the question was whether the public took alarm, and did in fact the public take alarm at the opioid epidemic of that time period?
Yes, and I apologize for going into too specific an example.
That's okay, but the point is, did you come across in your research evidence of the public taking alarm? at
Yes.
these? How did that affect the sale of patent medications?
They fell.
And how did it affect whether or not opioids would be included in patent medicines?
Many of the makers of these products either dropped drugs altogether, or they reduce the amount of the drug in the formula.
And what happened to Miss Winslow's syrup?
That was a good example. Eventually, they gradually reduced the amount of the morphine content and then did away with it altogether.
Did away with it altogether. Based on your research, was that so that they could continue selling the product?
Yes, it had become a liability.
Did makers of patent medications seize an opportunity here with the public now rejecting medicines that did contain opioids?
They did, or some did, yes.
And have you seen examples of that in your research?
I have.
Have you seen an example of that in an advertisement here in Oklahoma?
I have.
And what was that advertisement for, if you recall?
Oh, Fletcher's Castoria.
And you pulled that from the Mangum Sun Monitor, is that correct?
That's correct.
Permission to approach, Judge.
Yes.
Thank you.
Dr. Cortright, is this that Mangum Sun Monitor?
Yes, this is the ad.
This is from right here in Oklahoma.
Yes, and it appeared in 1913.
And is the ad on the second page here?
Yes.
And on the third page, have I blown that ad up for you?
Yes.
And
Thank you.
did you provide this ad to me?
Yes.
You found this in your research?
Yes.
And this demonstrates, in your expert opinion, makers of medicine seizing on the opportunity to brag about their medicines not containing opioids.
Yes.
Objection, Your Honor, leading again.
Objection overruled.
Thank you.
Your Honor, with that testimony, permission to publish this so that Dr. Cortright can explain this exhibit.
Permission granted.
Excuse me. All right. Dr. Cortright, can you please explain the significance of this Castoria ad?
Well, the thing that strikes me as particularly interesting is that underneath the label Castoria, it goes on to explain that this is a useful preparation for a variety of things. But then it says promotes digestion, rest, etc., but contains neither opium nor morphine nor mineral, and then all caps, not narcotic. So not having a narcotic drug became kind of selling point for many medicines, which is, I think, another illustration of the growing consumer awareness of the dangers of these drugs in the early 20th century.
Now, you and other historians have said that exposure to addiction through patent medicines was going down.
Correct.
What
Not
about
just historians, just contemporaries found the same thing.
what about regular prescriptions written by doctors? Were they also going down?
Yes, the percentage of prescriptions containing opiates was also declining during this time period.
So not only was narcotic conservatism incorporated by the medical community, was it also incorporated by the public?
Yes, there was that aspect to it.
Was narcotic conservatism also incorporated into medical training in medical schools in this country?
Yes.
And did you write about that in Dark Paradise?
Yes, I did.
If you'll grab Dark Paradise and turn to page 52, I'd like for you to read into the...
I think we're going to go ahead and take a break. Stop here and resume at 10:45.
Thank you, Judge.
Larry, you didn't do it.
right, Dr. Cortright, we were just talking about whether or not narcotic conservatism made its way into medical textbooks used in medical schools. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And is that something that you covered in your book, Dark Paradise?
Yes, although I don't seem to have a copy of it here. If you could, someone could hand me the exhibit.
May I approach, Judge?
Yes.
It's right over there. No, it's right here. Right there. Thank you.
And can you turn to page 52 of your book, please, sir? And does this page deal with your research into narcotic conservatism making its way into textbooks?
It does, yes.
Okay, and what did you find, Dr. Cortright?
Well, I found an interesting example in the field of gynecology. I found literally a generational difference. There was if I can simply read the passage.
Sure.
All right. During the 1890s, warnings previously confined to medical journals began percolating into medical curricula. Advice offered in one generation of textbooks was frequently contradicted in the next, as seen in the writings of two famous American gynecologists, William Byford and his son Henry G. Byford. In his 1865 text, with your permission, I'll skip the long title, the elder Byford counseled the use of opium in dysmenorrhea as part of an energetic palliative treatment. That's a quote. Standard practice for the time. However, in the 1898 American Textbook of Gynecology, which was co-authored by his son, the younger Byford, this course was condemned in the strongest possible terms. He who is compelled to resort frequently to opium and stimulants in dysmenorrhea, basically painful menstrual symptoms, must be considered devoid in diagnostic ability and consequently ought not to be entrusted with the management of such cases.
And did you find any other examples of narcotic conservatism in medical teaching?
Yes, just to briefly continue the same passage, similar sentiments were expressed by neurologist William J. Herdman. I have not failed in my attempt, he says this in 1902, to impress on the minds of my students how unwise is the indiscriminate use of these powerful drugs. Again, that's a direct quote.
Now, we did have some examples in the literature, and even new, younger doctors were being trained about narcotic conservatism. But were there still some doctors that did not adopt narcotic conservatism?
Yes. Again, it was a gradual process.
What do we know about those doctors that continued against this advice of narcotic conservatism?
We know quite a lot, actually. There was a very good study which showed, this was a Pennsylvania-based study, which showed that 90% of all prescriptions in 1919 were being written by just 1/3 of the doctors. Now, about 150 of those doctors were out-and-out dope doctors. That was a term that they used back in the early 20th century. They were greedy. They were writing the prescriptions for money. But the other doctors who were heavy prescribers were not necessarily mercenary, but they were older. They were almost exclusively over the age of 50. And they were people who had been trained, as Dr. Thomas Blair, who wrote the article, put it, they were people who were trained before the narcotics menace was emphasized in medical education. Whereas virtually all of the low prescribers in the study were younger doctors or mid-career professionals who were keeping abreast of the literature.
You use the word dope doctor. Is that kind of like the pill mills of today?
Yes, they weren't necessarily operating out of buildings called pill mills, but yes, they were basically writing the prescriptions for money, yes.
So by the early 20th century, was over-reliance on opioids to treat everyday pain viewed as an out-of-date practice?
Yes, very much so.
All right, Dr. Cortright, you've said that we were creating fewer new addicts and prescribing opioids was declining. Again, is it your testimony that we were in fact able to put an end to the first opioid addiction epidemic in this country?
Yes. And not only were we creating fewer new addicts, but you have to keep in mind that many of the people who became addicted to these drugs in the late 19th and the early 20th century, they were older people with serious illnesses, and they didn't necessarily live for a long time. So as they were dying off, basically they weren't replaced, and that caused the overall level of addiction to go down.
Thanks, Doctor. Now, we've talked a lot about the liberal prescribing of opioids during this time. Has there ever been any controversy about prescribing opioids for cancer pain or end-of-life pain?
Oh, no, it was generally understood that when you're dealing with cases of terminal illness, that that's not an inappropriate use, no.
That was true back in the time period you've been discussing today?
Oh, yes.
Is the concern that narcotic conservatism addressed, was it the use of opioids to treat chronic non-cancer pain?
Yes.
Now, you created a diagram that you published in Dark Paradise to help illustrate how the number of medical opioid addicts declined, right?
Yes.
And that is on page 183 of Dark Paradise, correct?
Yes.
All right, and is this part of that, that diagram that you made?
It is, yes.
And can you please explain this diagram to the court?
Well, this is a kind of summation of the book, or at least the first part of the book. Most addiction in the late 19th century was medical. That's the white area that you see in the diagram. And then there's an inner core of non-medical addicts, and then it's labeled that most of the medical addicts used opium or morphine, and then there was this subculture of opium smokers in the Chinese community and the white underworld. And then the important idea here is that this diagram looks like an imploding star. As doctors become more conservative, as this older generation of addicts dies off, what you get is lower overall prevalence and also a change in the composition of the addict population, so that the non-medical types become more prominent as the medical type diminishes over time. That's what I'm trying to illustrate here.
Have we always had non-medical addicts?
Yes.
And have we always had dope doctors?
Yes.
Now, Dr. Cortright, we see here that by 1935, medical addiction had declined substantially, but there is still some non-medical addicts, and you say mainly using heroin, right? By 1935.
Yes, by 1935, heroin had become the primary black market drug in the United States, which I think illustrates an important point, which is the fungibility of drugs.
What do you mean by that, fungibility?
Well, to coin a phrase, the one you start with is not necessarily the one you stay with. One of the things that really interested me in my research is that people would start off on a particular drug, like smoking opium, and because the market shifted, because the drug became expensive or unavailable, they had some problem obtaining it, they would shift and they would use another drug like morphine or heroin. There's a lot of switching that goes on as market circumstances change.
Thank you, Dr. Cortright. In addition to reducing the number of new medical addicts, did we in this country also begin to treat those remaining addicts?
Yes, we did.
And was that something that was incorporated into our society?
Yes, it was literally institutionalized. Congress passed legislation in the late 1920s that authorized the creation of two major institutions, the federal narcotic hospitals, or farms as they were sometimes called. One opened in Lexington in 1935 and another in Fort Worth in 1938.
Thank you, Doctor. Now, we've discussed a lot of different medical literature, a lot of different records, a lot of different case studies, all from a long time ago. But did this idea of narcotic conservatism continue through the 20th century?
Yes. Not only did the idea of narcotic conservatism continue, but this mission, this idea that it'd be a good idea to abate the problem by treating it, yes, this continued through the 20th century, and in fact, treatment would expand significantly in the 1960s and 1970s.
And were we continuing to teach our new doctors that they should be conservative in their approach to opioids
Oh, very much so, yes.
into the 60s and 70s and 80s?
Yes.
And do you have any examples of the kinds of textbooks that existed then and what those textbooks would say?
Well, the classic example is Goodman and Gilman's pharmacology textbook, which was published in 1941, which carried forward this tradition of what I'm calling narcotic conservatism.
And what were some of the instructions that were given during this part of the middle to late 20th century?
Oh, for example, give opiates for a very short period of time. If you do give opiates, be sure you follow up and make sure that the patient is not showing any signs of addiction. That's advice that's included in this classic text. Never use a narcotic when another drug will do is part of the recommendations in the section on narcotics.
What was the standard teaching about how long it might take to get addicted to these drugs?
Well, and Goodman and Gilman comment that the time would vary, and in a lot of cases it might take 10 days or 2 weeks, but you never knew, and this is, I think, a point we heard Dr. Rojas testify to yesterday, is that there were some people who were more susceptible and might be only a few doses before they were really into the drug. And so that was another reason to be extremely cautious.
Dr. Cortright, by the 1980s, early 90s, had narcotic conservatism been firmly established in the medical community, in our society, and through regulation?
Certainly by the early 1980s, this was standard part of the medical curriculum, and this was something that was taught to doctors. Yes.
Now, were the reasons for narcotic conservatism and all the sources that you've talked about today, are those publicly available?
Yes.
Anybody can access them?
Yes.
Now, do you think that these kinds of sources and the history that you've talked about today, do you think it's important for a drug company that manufactures opioids to be familiar with this history?
Yes.
Excuse me, Your Honor, I don't know that he is qualified to render an opinion about what pharmaceutical companies should or should not be concerned about as a historian.
Your Honor, he's a historian for that very purpose, to teach us what has happened in the past. History lessons are there for a reason. And I'd like to ask him why these are important lessons.
Overrule the objection.
Thank you, Your Honor.
And Dr. Cortright, do you think that a maker of opioids, a drug company that manufactures opioids, should be familiar with the history of opioid addiction in this country that you've described today?
Same
Yes.
objection, Your Honor. Sorry, I'm sorry, Doctor, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but you understand I have to object at times.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Same objection, Your Honor.
Oh, look, I think it's a lesson that everyone should be familiar with, including the makers of pharmaceutical products, yes.
And anybody could have had access to these materials that you've looked at, because you found them yourself, didn't you?
Yes, when I began my researches in the late 1970s, I was an obscure graduate student with a library card, and I had no trouble running these things down.
Are you aware of anything that would prevent Johnson & Johnson from gaining access to the same materials that you gained access to?
No.
You aware of anything?
Excuse me, same objection.
Are you aware of anything that would have prevented Johnson & Johnson from being familiar with this history?
No, these sources and the bibliographies that catalog them were available in every medical library in the country.
Now, Doctor, I want to go back to this demonstrative that you created showing narcotic conservatism. And to summarize, narcotic conservatism, did it act as a barrier to overprescribing for over 100 years?
It did.
Did it work as a barrier to overconsumption in this country for over 100 years?
It did.
Did it prevent another medical opioid addiction epidemic in this country for 100 years?
Yes, it did.
And you've shown it here as a dam or a barrier in this graphic.
Yes.
Dr. Cortright, in your expert opinion, someone who has studied medicine and history of opioid addiction epidemics and how they started, why would anybody ever want to remove that barrier?
Objection, Your Honor. Calls for something the witness is not qualified to render an opinion on.
Your Honor,
Speculates as to motive.
Your Honor, he's someone who has researched this for a very long time.
I'm going to overrule the objection.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Let me ask the question again. Why would anyone want to remove or undermine that barrier to overprescribing and overconsumption?
Well, because unfortunately, there were still a lot of people suffering from chronic pain, and there weren't a lot of easy or convenient solutions to that problem. And it was also unfortunate that even though the government had been looking for the holy grail of a non-addictive narcotic analgesic with morphine-like powers since the late 1920s, they'd never found it. But if any company marketed a product as if it were that holy grail, they would be in a position to make a lot of money.
Pass the witness.
You're not here to testify about pharmaceutical marketing, are you?
No, I'm not.
You are not a physician, are you?
I am not a physician, no.
You have not spoken to any doctors in Oklahoma in preparation of your testimony today, have you?
I had spoken to one, yes. I had not spoken before the deposition.
Well, you understand all I know is what you said under oath in your deposition.
I understand that.
So at the time you gave your opinions in this case, you hadn't talked to a single doctor in Oklahoma.
That is correct.
You hadn't talked to a single patient in Oklahoma, had you?
Not talked. I had used Oklahoma sources in my research for Dark Paradise, but no, I hadn't interviewed anyone.
Dark Paradise, your book was written in 1981.
No, it was published in 1982, and it was updated with additional chapters and then republished in 2001.
I'm sorry, I got the wrong year, 1982, and then republished in 2001, correct?
Within an expanded edition, yes.
Yeah. So that book and all its teachings were on the market during those years.
Would you specify those years?
1982 forward.
Yes, correct.
Okay. And all of these, your book, I'm just letting you know. Your book, the ads you've discussed, Boston Medical Journal,
Medical and Surgical Journal.
Medical and Surgical Journal. This one you talked about.
Yes. Drugs that enslave.
This one.
Yeah, the medical record piece, yes.
All of those, plus the textbook that you described from the 60s, are publicly available, right?
Yes, sir.
Publicly available, you said, to pharmaceutical manufacturers?
They were and still are. They're available to everyone.
Well, I want to go into everyone because you single pharmaceutical manufacturers out just because you were asked about them. How about regulators for the state of Oklahoma?
Yes.
Physicians in the state of Oklahoma?
Yes, they would have been available.
Regulators for the United States government?
They would have had access to these materials too.
When was the Controlled Substances Act passed?
It was enacted in 1970 and took effect in 1971.
Does the Controlled Substances Act schedule drugs?
It does.
Heroin, for example, is in what schedule?
Schedule 1.
As an illicit drug.
Yes, sir.
What is Schedule 2?
Well, Schedule 2 consists of drugs that have a high abuse potential and/or low therapeutic value.
And are those, does that schedule include opioids?
It includes many opioids, yes.
Do you believe that doctors in Oklahoma who prescribe Class 2 drugs know that they contain the potential for addiction?
Doctors,
Your Honor, real quick, he's trying to make a point that he hasn't talked to anybody in Oklahoma. Now he's asking what doctors in Oklahoma. It's a contradictory position, so
I'll overrule the objection. Go ahead, Mr. Robert.
Do you understand the question?
no, please repeat the question.
Do you believe that doctors who prescribe Schedule 2 drugs in Oklahoma know that they have the capacity, a high capacity for addiction?
That is part of the information that they have at their disposal, yes.
What is the Drug Enforcement Administration?
The Drug Enforcement Administration is the nation's chief law enforcement agency. It's the successor to the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, which was in turn the successor to the Bureau of Narcotics. I'm sorry, I said that the wrong way. It was the BON and then the BNDD and then now DEA.
Does the Drug Enforcement Agency set quotas on the amount of Class 2 narcotics?
It does, and in fact, we've been setting quotas on drugs since the 1922 Jones-Miller Act.
And manufacturers have to produce within those quotas.
That's the ceiling, yes. And I would add to that
I think you answered my question.
Your Honor, I asked you to answer.
I think he did finish. He just thought of something else he wanted to say.
I'll overrule the state's objection.
Thank you. Can you give me just a second, Your Honor?
Yes, sir.
I need to consult my family.
That's fine.
I know, Doctor, I apologize. Your testimony at your deposition, you indicated you were not testifying to anything after 1980, correct?
I wasn't going into marketing specifics or anything like that. That's correct.
I think actually it was, you said, I'm not here to testify about anything after 1980. Do you remember that testimony?
Yes, however, I do want to make the point that as of 1980, that based on the information that was available, widely available to everyone at the time, that the consequences of an increase in supply and a reversal of the ethic of narcotic conservatism would have been apparent.
Yes.
That an epidemic would have been foreseeable.
I appreciate that, and you've testified to that here today, haven't you?
Yes.
Okay. And that includes everybody?
That's what I said, yes.
Okay. Now, prior to 1980, did you do any study on the pain and discomfort report that was given to the White House in 1979?
I did not, no.
So you're not aware that that paper looked at some of the very topics that you're discussing today?
I have just said that I had no awareness of that paper.
Now, you talked about supply, and you've told us that the supply of legal opioids is set by the DEA, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Who sets the supply for illegal opioids?
There is no government agency that sets a quota for illicit opiates. On the contrary, they try to suppress them.
You said with respect to the DEA setting quotas, they set ceilings? And I just want to make sure we understand one of them. They set production quotas, don't they?
Can you repeat the question?
They set production quotas, don't they?
Yes.
Okay.
Although, again, going back to 1922, they also set import quotas.
Okay, they set import quotas as well. Have since 1922?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for your testimony here today, Dr. Cortright.
Yes.
Dr. Cortright, you were asked some questions about whether this information we looked at today was available to state regulators, federal regulators, et cetera. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Dr. Cortright, does the state of Oklahoma make opioids?
Does the state of Oklahoma make? No, it does not.
Dr. Cortright, does the United States government make opioids?
No, it does not.
Do physicians make opioids?
They do not.
Does Johnson & Johnson make and sell opioids?
It does.
Does Johnson & Johnson make and sell active pharmaceutical ingredients that go into other people's opioids?
It does.
Now, you've also been asked some questions about supply. Did you say that supply has been regulated since 1922?
Yes, actually, in a sense, even before 1922. One of the things that a lot of people don't understand is that we have been de facto scheduling drugs since the late 19th century. Many municipalities and states, and eventually the federal government, for example, outlawed opium that had been prepared for smoking. In 1924, the Congress of the United States outlawed the manufacture of heroin. There wasn't a Controlled Substances Act, but these were, in effect, these were Schedule I drugs. So yes, we've been in the business of regulating drugs for a long time.
Supply has been regulated since 1922. Dr. Cortright, did we have a medical opioid addiction epidemic for the vast majority of the 20th century?
We did not.
But supply was being regulated during that time?
That's correct.
Now, Dr. Cortright, you mentioned that the supply and quota limits were a ceiling. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Does a drug manufacturer have to make all of its quota?
No.
Thank you. No further questions, Your Honor.
I have just a few that reference what Mr. Duck just asked about. Thank you. Doctor, just a few more and you'll be done, okay?
Sure.
Does the U.S. government regulate opioids?
Yes.
Does the state of Oklahoma regulate opioid prescribing?
Yes.
Can a patient legally obtain an opioid without a prescription?
No.
Now, you talked about the state of Oklahoma. Do you know what the Drug Utilization Review Board is?
In Oklahoma, I'm not familiar with its workings, no.
You haven't reviewed the minutes of the Drug Utilization Review Board of Oklahoma?
Your Honor, I object. It's being beyond the scope of my
I'm sorry, he asked about, does the state make opioids? I'm trying to respect.
That's answered your question.
Thank you. And Doctor, your testimony stops at 1980, I understand. But in 1980, did Duragesic exist?
No,
In 1980, did Nucenta exist?
it did not.
Are you familiar with tapentadol?
As an ingredient in Nucenta,
Yeah,
I'm familiar with it.
that's all.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, I did not come here today to testify to the neurochemical effects of this particular drug, no.
All right, thank you. That's all I have, Doctor.
Thank you, Your Honor. May Dr. Cortright be excused?
Yes, you may.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Statement calls next witness.
So what you're going to say?
Your Honor, at this time, the state will call a trial deposition video of Dr. Russell Portnoy, who was one of Johnson & Johnson & Janssen's leading key opinion leaders. We took this in New Hampshire back in January, and we'll play him now. It'll be we'll get it started if the court's allowed.
Sure.
Go through that.
I plan on just breaking promptly at 12 noon. I'm sure Dr. Portnoy won't object since he's again.
He indeed will not, and with that, we'll get it started. And if the court doesn't mind, maybe we'll just turn this one a little bit too so they can see it, and we'll get it started. Your Honor, may I approve?
Yes, you may.
We got a copy. These are just.
Can you tell the judge and jury your name, please, sir?
Dr. Russell Portnoy.
Is it Portnoy?
Yes.
I'll do my best for that. Dr. Portnoy, I am Brad Bedford. I represent the state of Oklahoma through its Attorney General, Mike Hunter. Do you understand that?
Yes.
Now, you are here today to give testimony under oath, under penalty of perjury, about some things that have happened in your life and career over the last 20 years, correct?
Yes.
Let's start with this. You're currently the executive director of the MJHS Institute for Innovation in Palliative Care and the chief medical officer of MJHS as well, correct?
Chief Medical Officer of NJHS Hospice and Palliative Care.
What is MJHS?
It's the DBA of Metropolitan Jewish Health System.
Do you mind about a second? I noticed there's a little bit of a lag. Is there a way to correct that?
Can you tell the judge and jury your name, please, sir?
I'm Dr. Russell Portnoy.
Is it Portnoy?
Yes.
I'll do my best for that. Dr. Portnoy, I am Brad Bedford. I represent the state of Oklahoma through its Attorney General, Mike Hunter. Do you understand that?
Yes.
Now, you are here today to give testimony under oath, under penalty of perjury, about some things that have happened in your life and career over the last 20 years, correct?
Yes.
Let's start with this. You're currently the executive director of the MJHS Institute for Innovation in Palliative Care and the chief medical officer of MJHS as well, correct?
Chief Medical Officer of NJHS Hospice and Palliative Care.
What is MJHS?
It's the DBA of Metropolitan Jewish Health System,
And where is that located?
New York City.
You've been in this position or working for MJ since about 2014, correct?
That's right.
Prior to that time, you were employed by something called the Beth Israel Medical Center in New York, correct?
Correct.
While it changed some parts of its name over time, Beth Israel will reflect that instance, correct?
Yes.
You worked there from about 1997 to 2014, correct?
Yes.
And at some point, you were the chair of Beth Israel's Department of Pain Medicine and Palliative Care.
For that entire period.
You understand that today, I'm here on behalf of the state of Oklahoma due to a trial we had against certain pharmaceutical companies. You understand?
I understand, yes.
You also understand that one of the defendants in this case is Purdue
Yes,
and related entities to Purdue.
yes,
You also understand that Janssen and Johnson & Johnson are defendants as well.
yes,
You understand that Teva is a defendant
yes,
and Cephalon.
yes,
And you see in your room, that the room we're in today, that the drug companies that I've just listed, they're represented by lawyers, correct?
yes,
Over the course of your career, you've been paid to be a speaker or advisor to many pharmaceutical companies who make opioid products, correct?
correct,
And you've been paid to be a speaker or advisor for the Purdue defendants,
yes,
also for the Janssen entity
yes,
and Johnson & Johnson.
yes.
Cephalon,
Cephalon, yes,
you've done speaking or advising work for Cephalon.
yes,
You also were involved in a group called the American Pain Society.
yes,
You were on the board,
yes.
and for a few years you served as its president
Just a single term, single 1-year term.
of the American Pain Society.
Yes,
You understand that the defendants from the drug world that are here today provided funding to the American Pain Society.
yes,
Sir, you're not the state of Oklahoma's witness, are you?
no,
You don't work for us.
no, I do not.
I have no control over you.
You do not.
You have no purpose in helping me win our lawsuit.
No,
You're here as an independent third party, correct?
yes,
You're represented by your own counsel, correct?
I am.
There's nothing to prevent you from saying things that may be adverse to our case, correct?
That's true.
Okay. You're here to speak the truth.
That's true.
I have no control over you.
That's true.
Now, you also were involved with a group called the American Pain Foundation.
Yes,
You served on its board.
yes,
You understand that the drug company defendants that are here in this case provided funding to the American Pain Foundation.
yes,
Now, at some point in your career, you've prepared a resume, correct?
yes,
I'm going to hand you what we'll mark as Portnoy Exhibit 1. Sir, this is a document that your attorney, Mr. Spencer, just provided to me as an updated copy of your resume. I'm going to hand this to you, Plaintiff's Exhibit 1 to the Portnoy deposition. Is Exhibit 1 the resume that your attorney handed us today?
yes,
Does this resume set out a summary of your work, education, and experience?
yes, it does.
Is it a record that you created?
Yes,
Is it a record that you kept?
yes,
The document that's in front of us is a fair summary of your experience, work, and qualifications as a professional.
yes,
Now, you are a medical doctor.
yes,
You treated pain patients prior to today.
yes,
You still are doing it.
yes,
Now, you have signed a declaration in this case, correct?
yes,
And just to go over this again, you and I have never met before today, correct?
that's correct.
I met you less than an hour ago here at your attorney's office.
That's correct.
We shook hands, we introduced ourselves,
Yes,
and you left the room.
I did.
Did you and I have any conversation outside the presence of your attorney?
No,
Have you ever met with anyone, to your knowledge, representing the state of Oklahoma about this lawsuit prior to this very day?
no,
To your knowledge, have I ever been to the state of New Hampshire to meet with your attorney about this case?
no,
I'm going to hand you now, and we'll mark this plaintiff's Exhibit 2, so the Portnoy deposition. Now, Dr. Portnoy, Exhibit 2 that we just gave you is a declaration that you signed in this case, correct?
yes,
And if you'll turn to the last page, page 35, the date of this is actually January 17, 2019, correct?
correct.
Now, this declaration is based on your personal knowledge, correct?
Yes,
It is based on your professional experience,
yes,
the direct interactions that you have with the pharmaceutical industry.
yes,
And those direct interactions include interactions with Purdue and its related companies.
yes,
They include interactions with Janssen.
yes,
Those experiences include interactions with Johnson & Johnson.
yes,
You understand that you've had interactions with Cephalon,
yes,
and Cephalon's an entity that Teva purchased.
yes,
And you're represented by Mrs. Amy Spencer, who's to your left, right?
yes,
You're not represented by any of these drug company lawyers, are you?
no,
You notice that every time I ask you a question, they object.
I do, yes,
Now, In our case, there is no proffer agreement.
Correct.
There's no formal settlement agreement.
Correct.
As we established, we've never met before to negotiate this.
True.
And you have signed the declaration that is now Exhibit 2 under penalty of perjury, right?
Correct.
Meaning you swore that the statements in there were true, correct?
Correct.
And that they were yours.
That's correct.
And as we established earlier, the statements contained in Exhibit 2 are based upon your personal knowledge, experience, skill, and training.
True.
And we're here today, your attorney, Mrs. Spencer, is here in the room.
Yes.
You've got the declaration in front of you.
Yes.
Are these statements that you made in that declaration true to the best of your knowledge?
Yes.
Do you adopt the statements in Exhibit 2 in their entirety?
I do.
Are they true?
Yes.
Do you swear that they're true?
Yes.
Now, you understand that we have not sued you in our case, correct?
Correct.
You also understand that I've represented to your attorney that the state of Oklahoma has no intent to add you as a defendant in our case, correct?
Correct.
But we've signed no formal settlement agreement.
That's correct.
You're here under the trust that you're going to tell the truth and that what I told your attorney is true.
That's correct.
That's the only agreement that you know of in this case.
That's true.
You're a doctor.
Yes.
You spent your career dealing with the pain industry, or the treatment of chronic pain,
Yes.
palliative care,
Yes.
cancer care.
Yes.
You've done quite a bit of work, research, and publication about those things.
Yes, I have.
You understand that you had influence.
Yes.
I'm not trying to play your ego, but you were viewed as a important or influential spokesperson on many issues related to the treatment of pain in America. Would you agree with that?
I would I would have some concerns about the word spokespersons. I never spoke for anybody except for myself.
A speaker.
A speaker, yes.
And you understand through your dealings with the pharmaceutical industry that they advertise,
Yes.
that they market.
Yes.
And there's a difference between advertising on TV and marketing to healthcare professionals.
Yes.
You understand that some of the ways that the drug company defendants marketed was to have dinners and presentations where doctors spoke to other doctors.
Yes.
You understand that they used marketing materials,
Yes.
that they partnered with different third-party advocacy groups or academic groups to hold seminars, symposiums, and congresses,
Yes.
and that doctors would attend those types of things, correct?
Correct.
As well as other healthcare providers.
Yes.
And you understand that doctors could be influenced by the information they obtain from any of the types of things that we just spoke about.
Yes.
And you understand that pharmaceutical companies, at least the ones here in this room, they weren't providing this type of education pro bono, meaning they just did it for completely altruistic purposes. You know that.
So I've interacted with the industry for many years on a large number of educational conferences, as well as individual opportunities to lecture. It has always been clear to me that the dollars that were placed into the effort to expand education had an ultimate purpose to assist their growth in the commercial market. But I also think that, at least with respect to chronic pain, there was an effort on the part of some in the industry to make sure that the medical community got educated, because the problem of chronic pain was viewed as such a public health problem.
The idea that pain needed to be treated.
Yes.
And of course, one of the ways that you treat chronic pain, if it's identified as a public health problem, is through the drugs that each of the defendants in this room make and sell, right?
One of the ways to do it, yes.
Including opioids.
That's correct.
And you understand, because you're a doctor, that when you have all of this information coming at you, it forms part of the basis of a doctor's knowledge.
Yes, that's true.
And it has the potential to influence decision-making.
Yes,
And that's part of its intent.
that's correct.
What I want to talk with you about today is whether you believe that the drug companies in this room used the work that you did and the work that others did to try to improperly influence the decision-making of healthcare providers in this country. Okay?
Okay.
And you believe, in fact, that that did happen.
Yes,
You're just one person.
that's true.
You don't have the ability by yourself to create an opioid crisis, do you?
No, I do not.
If there is one, it took a lot of factors,
That's correct.
including each of the drug company defendants sitting in this room,
Including some of the actions taken by each of the drug companies, yes.
their actions,
Correct.
including the way they used your work.
I believe that's true, yes.
Make sure I heard that right with the objection. You said what?
I believe that that's true, yes.
Thank you. Now, throughout your career, you accepted financial support. Let's go back to the last question. You said you believe what I said is true, right?
Yes.
Again, the drug companies that are sitting here in the room that we're referring to include Purdue, correct?
Yes.
Janssen,
Yes.
Johnson & Johnson,
Yes.
Teva,
Yes.
Cephalon.
Yes.
All of those are included in the statement you just made.
Yes.
Your answer was yes, all those defendants are included in the statement you made.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, throughout your career, it is true that in one way or another, you accepted financial support from drug companies.
Yes.
Those payments included some payments that were made to you directly.
Yes.
Those payments also included payments made to your institutional employer to support research or academic activities.
That's correct.
And one way that you were paid, sir, is through something called an honoraria for speaking engagements.
Yes.
I'm not sure everyone that's going to be listening to you understands what honoraria is. Can you describe that?
An honorarium is a fee paid by the sponsor of the conference so that the speaker will come to the conference and give a lecture.
Well, if you were giving a speech or anyone were giving a speech at certain types of educational conferences, say for a hospital, the drug company could not pay you directly for that work.
So probably the best example of what you're saying is that if the drug company was sponsoring a conference at a professional society meeting, such as an annual meeting of the professional society, the educational payment would go to the professional society, and then the professional society may be able to transfer an honorarium to the speakers.
Right, so that's exactly what I was saying. So, for example, if you gave a speech at a hospital in Oklahoma for an education event, the way that could work was that the drug company would pay money to the institution, and then your fee would be paid by the institution, not directly from the drug company.
In the early part of the time epic that we're talking about, it was much more common for an honorarium to be offered to the physician personally. Then, as the rules pertaining to continuing medical education became more stringent, the pharmaceutical industry began to a much greater extent providing funding to the organizational sponsor of a conference, and then that sponsor would pay the honorarium. So there was a shift over time to the perspective that you described.
Okay, so you also got paid fees for consulting,
Yes.
and those fees were paid for consulting with drug companies,
Yes.
including opioid manufacturers.
Yes.
The honoraria that you received for speaking almost always involved conferences that provided continuing medical education credits.
Yes.
And as we just discussed, that's where you would speak to healthcare providers,
Yes.
including doctors who would use opioids to treat pain,
Usually not.
usually doctors. Correct?
Correct.
And sometimes those speaking engagements were organized directly by a drug company,
Yes.
sponsored by a drug company.
Yes.
They would, sometimes the drug companies would pay you.
They would provide the honorarium.
The drug companies would provide the honorarium.
Yes.
They also use something called medical education companies, correct?
Correct.
And when that happened, you would get paid through the medical education company, correct?
That's correct.
And you've remarked that this use of medical education companies to be between the drug company and the speaker is something that increased over your career.
Yes, sir.
What is that?
Medical education companies are commercial entities that sign contracts with industry partners like the pharmaceutical companies, and they have different sets of tasks and different expertise. Sometimes they are capable of planning and organizing a conference, getting the speakers, signing the speakers up, providing the speakers with help and with transportation and potentially any written materials that go along with the conference. Other medical education companies develop programs sponsored by the pharmaceutical companies with payment to them. But those programs, for example, might be online programs that they put on the internet. So these medical education companies, to a much greater extent later in my career than earlier in my career, would work with academicians like myself on this kind of programming.
And based on your personal experience and knowledge, when medical education companies would do all that, where were they getting the money for?
From the pharmaceutical companies that were paying their sponsorship of it.
Now, you worked with several different medical education companies in this manner.
Yes.
None of them ever came to you and said, look, we're going to have you do a speech for Janssen, and if you do that, you can't have you work for Purdue, Teva, or Cephalon.
That never happened, no.
That never happened.
No.
Because I'm using a pretty broad term.
Yeah.
You understand that certain medical education companies did work for each different.
Yes, certain medical education companies, I should clarify, so there were medical education companies that had a preferred relationship with one or another company, but there were also medical education companies that might be involved with several.
Now, there were also two types of payments that can be made to your employer at Israel, correct?
Yes.
One of those was an educational grant,
Yes.
and that's when a grant of money is done to help develop and implement academic conferences or writing regarding education materials.
So the educational grant might support a conference, it might support a new program, it might support an online educational program, as long as the product, the outcome was educational, it would fall into that mechanism.
The drug companies also paid your employer and institutions like it for something called a research grant.
That's correct.
Now, in addition to these different types of payments, another way that a person like you and you yourself got paid was through a consulting fee.
Yes.
Consulting fees occurred when you did things like attend an advisory board.
Yes.
Or assisted a drug company in the development of a research protocol.
Yes.
Educational grants to Beth Israel, your employer for many years, were sometimes paid directly by the drug company.
Yes.
And as we established a moment ago, they might also be paid through the vehicle of a medical education company.
Yes.
And again, when your employer got money from the medical education company, at some point that money was funded by a pharmaceutical company.
That's correct. Those dollars would come from the pharmaceutical company to the hospital, and then it would be placed into an account that I would use as chairman to implement the program. Those dollars could be used to offset salaries that were paid by the hospital for the people who were working on the program, but none of the employees, including myself, received extra money.
In addition to all of these different types of payments, third-party academic or advocacy groups also got funding from drug companies, correct?
Correct.
The American Pain Foundation was a voice that provided information to patients and patient advocates, correct?
Correct.
And it received funding from pharmaceutical companies that made opioids.
That's correct.
It depended, at some point, it depended on those funds to operate.
That's correct.
And in or around 2012, a committee of the United States Senate sent a request for information about the sources of that funding.
Yes.
And at that point in time, or after that point in time, the American Pain Foundation stopped taking money from pharmaceutical companies that make opioids.
Yes.
And after that, it was no longer able to exist.
That's correct.
Now, you agree that drug companies are a major source of research funding.
Yes.
You agree that this type of funding has the ability to influence study proposals.
Yes.
You believe that drug company research grants provided to academics for studies of approved drugs generally fund studies that aim to identify or confirm benefits that would be helpful in marketing.
I think that's true, yes.
And by helpful in marketing, what you mean is it's helpful to the marketing for the drug company that's providing the funding.
Yes.
And you also believe that drug companies pay honoraria, fees, and grants in a way that elevates specific messages.
Yes.
You believe that drug companies use the positive statements that you make about opioids to portray opioid treatment as safe and effective, correct?
Yes.
You believe that drug companies use your statements without also using your accompanying discussion of the risk that you included in papers and other things that you wrote, correct?
Yes.
Do you also believe, based upon your same personal knowledge, experience, education, understanding, that the defendants did this, provided this funding, with the intent of publishing results that could yield higher sales for them in the future?
Right, as I said, the scientific question could be valid. It could be of interest to the scientists in the company. It's certainly of interest to the scientists doing the research. But the rationale for the grant, will, in my view, will include consideration about whether or not the results of the study can be published and help the marketing interests of the company.
Well, you've also stated, have you not, that some of the work that's ostensibly created by academics in their interactions with medical education company vendors will actually reflect the work or influence of the pharmaceutical industry.
Yes, I believe that that's true.
So, but no matter what, it's happened.
I believe that's true, yes.
And when you use the word ostensibly, as I understand that, do you mean that the work looks like it's the work of the academic, but it actually has the influence of the pharmaceutical industry?
Yes.
And when that happens, that's a bad thing.
Yes, that's a bad thing.
They could be misleading.
Yes.
And as we established earlier, medical education companies like this, they get hired by drug companies,
Yes.
including the defendants here. Your answer is yes, including the defendants here.
Yes.
And part of their purpose, as you understand it based on your personal experience, is to help them sell more drugs.
What I would say is that the speakers programs had the primary objective to educate doctors, but the messages that doctors would give when giving talks for the speakers bureaus would generally favor the drugs provided or created by the drug companies.
All right, sir, I'm going to hand you a document marked Exhibit 3. This is a document produced by Janssen. It's called the Nucynta and Nucynta ER 2012 business plan. Feel free to look through that. I'm going to turn your attention to just a couple of parts. You understand the Nucynta and Nucynta ER are opioids that Janssen put out, right?
Yes.
If you'll turn to page 2 of this document, which is a PowerPoint, it lists objectives. You see that?
Yes.
And one of these objectives, it says, is review and gain alignment of 2012 tactics that support identified strategic imperatives.
Yes.
And then you see on the next page, it says 2012 business plan.
Yes.
Now, if you look through this, the very next page, page 4, looks at a chart of Nucynta prescriptions and a forecast over the next year. You see that?
Yes.
If you'll turn, sir, to page 8. Take a look at that for just a second. Now, page 8 of Exhibit 4, I believe it's 4, Exhibit 3, page 8 of Exhibit 3 has a box there that's titled What We've Learned from Our Customers, Market Research, 2nd Q 2011, correct?
Yes.
And at the bottom, it has a box that says Nucynta selling efforts, correct?
Yes.
I know you've never seen this Janssen document before, but could you read the first bullet point there?
Highly promotionally sensitive.
And then what does it say underneath that?
Speakers' programs often trigger first use.
Referring to Nucynta,
Yes.
a drug that Janssen sold.
Yes.
Now, if you will turn please to page 10. There's another box there, and it says, Nucynta's success requires integrated efforts across stakeholders within their sites of care, correct?
Yes.
And then if you look there in there, it lists prescribers, correct?
Yes.
Payers
Yes.
and influencers.
Yes.
And then it lists sites of care, right?
Yes.
Right along with prescribers, in the influencer box, it lists several other types of stakeholders, correct?
Yes.
And one of those is professional and patient advocacy, right?
Yes.
Have you ever seen a document like this?
I have not seen this document.
Were you aware that Janssen knew that the first use of an opioid could be triggered by speakers that they paid to go out and speak in this way?
I wasn't aware of that.
But it certainly supports what you've testified to already, that you understand that the speaker programs that drug companies like Janssen used were done to help them sell more drugs.
Yes, that's correct.
They objected, but it's true, isn't it?
Yes.
Let me show you the next one, sir. Are you familiar with a drug called Duragesic?
Yes.
You understand that was a fentanyl product,
Yes.
an opioid,
Yes.
a Janssen product.
Yes.
Hand you exhibit 4, please. You've never seen this document before?
No, I have not.
We'll go through certain parts of it, and if there's anything I ask you need to read further, just let me know. This document starts by saying, with respect to Duragesic, coming off a record-breaking year of $543 million in 2001, the bar has been raised for Duragesic in 2002 to $692 million in sales, a 28% increase. You see that?
Yes.
If you go down 2 sentences, it says, you are our primary sales force that drives nearly 75% of the business through pain specialists and primary care physicians. It says that, doesn't it?
Yes.
And it says, over the past year, we have made considerable progress growing our market share with this audience.
Yes.
Now, it goes down on a bold part that says market update. You see that?
Yes.
It says market growth has slowed in the first half of 2002, and our need to focus on taking market share from OxyContin by selling head-to-head. You see that?
I do, yes.
So we're talking about Duragesic used in reference to taking market share from OxyContin.
Yes.
Okay? Now, Duragesic's a fentanyl patch.
Yes.
OxyContin's a pill.
Yes.
Duragesic made by Janssen.
Yes.
OxyContin, name brand, made by Purdue.
Yes.
You know they're generic versions of OxyContin.
Yes.
Now, if we go to the strategic focus here for the sales effort, you see something called physician target, call plan attainment, impactful message delivery. Do you see that?
Yes.
At the bottom of that, it says success means increasing Duragesic share at the expense of OxyContin with all of our targeted physicians, not just concentrating on the highest decile targets. See that?
I do, yes.
And did you know that Janssen referred to healthcare providers as targets?
I didn't know.
Did you know that during the internal sales process that Janssen and Purdue and Teva used, that they referred to the doctors they interface with as targets?
I did not know.
Did you know that they deployed their sales force to go talk to doctors that were identified literally as targets?
I knew that they deployed their sales force to talk to doctors, not that they labeled the doctors as targets.
Did you know that they referred to the sales process of going to targets as something called detailing?
Yes.
Did you know that these companies obtain prescription data through something called IMS, where they can tell the prescribing habits of every doctor that they call upon?
Yes, I know.
Did you know that they then took that data to rank their sales targets based on whether the target was likely to prescribe their drug?
Yes, I know that went on, yes.
And did you know that these companies rank those doctors based on something called their value, meaning that if they ranked high enough as a likely candidate to prescribe, then they were worthy of the time, money, and effort it took to go call upon it?
I didn't know that level of specificity.
You've been around a lot of doctors, haven't you?
Yes,
You've been around primary care physicians?
yes.
Do you think, based on your personal experience, training, your life's work in the pain space, that your average primary care physician knows that when a sales rep comes to them, they are being referred to as a target? I'm asking you based on your personal experience with primary care physicians that you know.
I don't think they would know that they're being labeled as a target, no.
And if you look here just below the last, where the paragraph is talking, we're reading, it says, our objective is to convince physicians that Duragesic is effective and safe to use in moderate to severe chronic pain, such as back pain and degenerative joint disease like osteoarthritis. Correct?
Yes,
That's what you're talking about, non-malignant, non-palliative.
that's correct.
Right. Now, you see what I see, right? Who is their target?
Physicians.
And it says our objective is to do something with respect to physicians. What word did Jansen use?
I'm not sure what you mean by the question, I'm sorry.
You'll look to the third line there in that paragraph. It says objective is to
Convince physicians that Duragesic is effective and safe to use in moderate to severe chronic pain, such as back pain and degenerative joint disease like osteoarthritis.
and the choice they used in this document for their sales force is the word convince.
Yes,
Convince who?
the physician.
So if you'll turn to the next page, please. You'll see it says something called, well, at the first full paragraph there, the first sentence says, based on extensive market research, we have enhanced our current promotional message to maximize our product benefits and address relevant issues among chronic pain physicians. You see that?
Yes,
And there, right below it in bold, it says sales materials programs new this cycle. Right?
yes,
If you go down, there's one that says non-personal selling, no rep involvement. And it lists a newsletter and a direct mail program. You see that?
yes.
Let's turn to the next page. There's another thing listed with respect to the sales effort about convincing doctors, isn't there?
Yes,
It's medical education, no rep involvement.
that's correct.
And there it lists something that says National Pain Education Council, NPEC invitation. You see that?
Yes.
And it lists an audience. Who is the audience?
Primary care, pain specialists, oncologists, residents, nurses, pharmacists.
And in this sales effort to use NPEC, there's a description of how to do it. What, would you read that for the jury where it says description?
Yes. National Pain Education Council is funded by an educational grant from Janssen. Invitation to participate in a multimedia CME program for physicians and other medical professionals on the appropriate opioid pharmacotherapy for chronic pain management. Announcement invites medical professionals to visit www.npegweb.org website.
Now, you were involved in the NPEC at some point, correct?
Yes.
Tell the jury what that was, please, sir.
I believe that I was the co-chair of NPEG, of the NPEG initiative.
And that was a CME, continuing medical education platform, correct?
That's correct.
And it was funded in part by Janssen.
I think it was funded, to my recollection, I think it was funded entirely by Janssen.
And so, did you know that in internal documents about selling Duragesic that Janssen intended to use that platform this way?
No, I did not.
Does it trouble you to know that now?
It does, yes.
Why does it trouble you?
The platform was a CME platform, and continuing medical education is supposed to be based on information that's balanced and comprehensive and medically appropriate. At best, there is a firewall between continuing medical education and marketing. That firewall has gotten a lot stronger in recent years because of the recognition that things like this were happening. But this, to me, demonstrates why the firewall was necessary, why the rules have gotten much stronger. Because continuing medical education programming, which was not intended for marketing purposes, and certainly the academic people who were devoting their energies to it were not considering themselves as contributing to marketing in any way, was actually being used by the company as a marketing strategy.
So let's go back to that real quick, but there's important parts to it. There were 3 entities listed there, right? There are the people that attend these engagements, right?
Yes.
Then there's the people that are lecturing or speaking at them, correct?
Yes.
And then there's the drug company, which in this case is Janssen, right?
Yes. And
Of the 3, 2 of them had no idea that Janssen internally was using this platform as a way to sell its drugs.
Well, certainly, I can't speak to whether physicians who attended would know or not, but I can speak for myself, and I didn't know, and I was the co-chair of the program.
They didn't tell you.
No.
That's trust.
Stop there.
Yes.
Right. We'll go ahead and break for lunch now. I'd like to start promptly at 1:30 p.m.
All right.